Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for On TV, Cops Are Always the Main Characters. Our presenter this evening is Kathryn VanArendonk. She's a staff writer at Vulture, a New York magazine, where she covers TV, stand-up comedy, and culture. She has a PhD in English from Stanford University, which she mostly uses as justification for having way too many books in her house. In addition to her written work, VanArendonk is a co-host of the weekly podcast Appointment Television. We're so pleased to have her here with us this evening. Thank you so much. Take it away, Kathryn.
Great. As Sophie mentioned, my name is Kathryn VanArendonk, and as we're talking about personal experience, and speaking from our own personal perspectives, I should say from the outset that, I am going to be talking a lot about police and policing, and this is not something that I have a lot of personal experience with, direct interactions with the police. What I have instead is a great deal of experience with watching the way police are depicted on television. And my professional experience and my sort of life experience as a student and a graduate student, and now as a magazine writer, a journalist, has been in thinking about narrative and in how we think about the way that narrative that we experience on TV and elsewhere sort of shapes the kinds of stories that we are comfortable with. And it turns out one of the stories that I think essentially anyone who grows up watching American TV or having that framework sort of around your life at all, one of those perspectives that you get all of the time is the perspective of cops. And so that is something that I want to look at the history of a little bit, and just address how the history of television has developed toward this just dominance of cop shows, and how that affects the way that we think about crime stories and police in the world. So I am going to start my presentation here. Let's see. Let me do this. And this. Okay, can everyone see this, my presentation?
It looks very clear.
Fantastic. All right, so the first thing I want to start with is to validate a sense that you may have, that I certainly had, that a huge chunk of the shows that you have access to at any given moment on broadcast television are crime shows. This is a little count that was done by The Hollywood Reporter earlier this year, and it shows percentage of crime shows as a total of percentage shows, but it's scripted shows. It's important to note that this is just scripted shows, so these are dramas, not reality shows, but that this is also just network television. So this is just on ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. So it doesn't include, any of the cable, HBO, FX, or any streaming services like Netflix, Amazon. So there's, a significant undercount of the number of crime shows in this chart. But as you can see, they represent, even just in those broadcast hours, a significant chunk of the total shows. In the last season, about 20% of what was available to you was a crime show. And even this, I think, is an undercount, because they, I have a link here. You can also Google to find sort of how they did this count. This doesn't include a lot of shows that I would classify in this category, shows like legal dramas, and some shows like 911, which also include emergency responders, among whom are cops. So I think this is even an undercount, but just to begin from the sense that there's just this dominance of crime television shows, and that they also tend to be, because of the way that they are made, where they are usually on network TV, stories that begin and end within an hour. And so it's very easy to play them out of order, to play, you know, all different sort of episodes from all different seasons. They can get syndicated very easily, which means that they show up on other cable networks like TNT. They tend to get programmed a lot. You can slot them very easily into any programming block that you need to, because they, you know, it's very easy to just take an hour of Blue Bloods here and an hour of SWAT there and sort of chunk them in without worrying that your audience will get confused by the narrative. So there's a lot of crime shows. The other thing to know is that this is not new. There have always been a lot of crime shows on TV. Some of the very earliest shows were developed from radio programs, and most importantly, Dragnet, which was originally a radio program and then developed for television, one of the earliest, most popular TV shows that then, you know, became its popularity then became proof of this concept for audiences and how successful it was for audiences and advertisers. So that led to shows like the FBI, Adam 12. There are many, many, many more. And I think we can all think of, when I'm speaking, some of these examples of shows. I have included just some that are recently canceled, many that are still on. There are some shows on here that I think that would not have been included in that list. For example, a show like Bull, which is primarily about prosecutors, a show like Mindhunter or Bosch, which are streaming service shows. Again, this was just like a top of my mind trying to come up with a list of crime shows. There are so many more. But these are the kinds of shows that I'm talking about when I'm thinking about when I'm talking about this category. Okay, so one of the first things to think about as we try to talk about the way that police have played a role on television since television's inception is the fact that when producers are making television shows and when writers are coming up with stories, cops are among their primary sources. So this is from a longer piece called How Police Censorship Shaped Hollywood. It's by Alyssa Rosenberg. It was published in the Washington Post. It's a great long read, and if you're interested in this, I really recommend making your way through it. But one of the things that Rosenberg describes is how crucial police were in the development of Dragnet. So I'll just read this paragraph. In pursuit of the access that would let him market Dragnet as an authentic look at police work, Jack Webb, the show's creator, forged an extraordinary partnership with the Los Angeles PD chief, William Parker, and department publicity wizard, Stanley Sheldon, accepting stringent censorship from the police department in exchange for story ideas, for logistical help, and a patina of truth. That bargain would help create America's first enduring cop drama, and it became a model for police storytelling for decades to come. So what Rosenberg is putting her finger on here is not just that we have this huge group of crime shows, most of which have the police as their protagonists, but that from the beginning, these shows have been shaped hand in glove with police departments themselves. And inevitably, that leads to a particular angle that these shows have because they are produced in concert with police sources. So as a result, police, particularly in those early years of television, the police are depicted as good guys. They are sort of bright, shiny, well-meaning, flawless characters who chase down crime, who behave with ethical standards at all times, and who are, without bias, or if they have bias, then their bias is good, basically, because they are produced from the perspective of the police who want their own want these images going out into the public to be positive. So there is another source that I would recommend very, very highly, which is a report that was produced by a group called Color of Change. It's called Normalizing Injustice, and it was produced in concert with the Hollywood Reporter. And they did a survey. It's a broader survey of crime shows on TV. And one of the things that so it includes network shows, but also streaming shows and cable shows. And they looked both at the makeup of the writers, the modern writers of crime shows, and then the breakdown of how those shows depict police and criminals. So these are just a few of the statistics that they gathered. They found 81% of writers of crime shows are white. 11% of writers are women of color. Only 9% of all of their writers across all of the series were Black. And 37% of the writers were women. So you can see that there is a non-representative group of people who are responsible for producing these shows. I don't have that statistic up here, but if you go to the report, they also note that, and this is a problem across TV more broadly, not just in crime shows, but for writing staffs, the most representative groups tend to be the least powerful. So a writing staff will often have more Black writers and people of color in the introductory script supervising positions. By the time you get up to the level of showrunner, they are predominantly white men. So it's not just that they are not representative as a whole, it's that the power is tilted toward almost always white people and often white men in those groups. And so when we think about the makeup of people who write TV crime, it inevitably has an impact on the shows themselves. This is another graph. It takes a little bit to explain exactly what this graph, it's a sort of a confusing image, but what they have done is break down the ratio of actions performed by police who are meant to be good versus bad actions performed by bad guys. On the upper left-hand side, you have a few shows, which are represented in green here, where most of the bad actions are done by characters that the show codes as bad. Everything in the orange and red are shows where the bad actions are done by characters that the show codes as good. And because these are all crime shows, and because most of the characters who are coded as good are police officers, what you have is a system of narrative where police officers who are good characters are still depicted as doing bad things. And the shows excuse that behavior because the cops are protagonists. It is a really troubling way of thinking about what happens when the primary characters who are police in most of these shows are then given permission to do whatever, slightly criminal. And so if you just think through in your mind, like what these often look like, they will be police officers who know that that guy's bad. They know that he's a really bad guy, but in order to get him, they just have to plant like a little bit of evidence, and so that behavior is excused. And that is a repeating pattern on these kinds of shows. Okay, so I have been talking about the way police are depicted on television in fictional shows, even though, as I have mentioned, in Dragnet and continuing through to today, often writers' rooms use police as sources, and so they are fictional only up into a point. But it is really vital that we also think about the centrality of cops in crime shows that are reality shows rather than fictional ones. This is a piece of artwork from a podcast that I cannot recommend enough called Running from Cops. It is mostly about the show Cops, which is an incredibly long-running reality show that has been finally put out to pasture. So too has a show called Live PD, which I'll talk about in a second. But I am personally concerned that those shows will be coming back, particularly Live PD, for reasons that I'll get to in a second. And so I don't want to just gloss over them as though they are gone from our culture. They are not. Cops and Live PD are reality shows that begin from two premises. One, that the police are the main characters. They are the people you follow. They are, when you're watching a camera follow people through their actions, the camera crews are embedded with the cops, not with the criminals. So inevitably, the stories that you are following are through the eyes of the police rather than from the criminals. The other thing about these shows, particularly Live PD, which is a show that is incredibly popular on a cable channel called A&E, is that they exist often with this excuse of transparency. So what the host of Live PD, Dan Abrams, will say is that they are not excusing police behavior. They are not lauding police behavior. They just want to let everyone have a look at what police do. So what happens on Live PD, or has happened for, this show was created in 2016, what has happened is that on every Friday night, you could tune into Live PD and they would have camera crews embedded with police departments across the country. And if you have not seen this show, what they do is they'll have a host sitting in a control room and he'll say, oh, it looks like something exciting is happening with the Portland PD. And then they will go live to that camera crew, or so you think, and you will see this live police interaction happening between a cop and a member of the public. There are a lot of problems with that model. One of the biggest is that it's not actually live. And so they have the tape delay of enough time that producers will know ahead of time whether or not that interaction is interesting. And for a show like this, interesting means somebody is a criminal. And so what you are getting is not a live look at how little crime there is in these cities. What you're instead getting is a condensed view of all of the most dramatic moments that they can find. The other thing is that in order to get permission to shoot these kinds of shows, police are allowed to veto any interaction that is happening that they do not want to be on television. And so while a show like Live PD was claiming to be transparent, what they were actually giving was a laundered view from the police perspective. And that played out to really tragic effect. A person was killed in an interaction with police. They happened to be filmed by Live PD, and that did not air on the show, and Live PD scrubbed that footage. And so this is the kind of thing that as we watch, it is really tempting to want to feel like this is actually transparent, that we are understanding a police perspective in a way that does not favor them over the people, across the camera from them. But they are almost always not just the main characters, but essentially the co-writers of these television shows. So I think one of the most important things to think about is in cop shows where police are the main characters, it has become such a default that I think it's easy to lose track of what perspectives we are not seeing on television. So it's almost hard to imagine, but you could think about instead alternatives where you were watching television shows about the communities of people who are regularly the subject of police action rather than the police officers. So if, for instance, your primary lens into like an interesting narrative tension was a group of people who are constantly being pulled over by the cops and then fear for their life, you would have a very different understanding of the relationship, say, between police and the community than you do if you are just following that cop over and over again. You also then would be able to see innocence as typical rather than unusual. If you think about the fact that we watch hour after hour after hour of crime procedural, every one of those hours has a criminal in it, and the lives of actual police officers do not involve that density of criminals. And so it leads to this sense that criminal behavior is everywhere, it is constant, it is pervasive, when in fact that is not the reality. I mean, the statistics have shown that crime is not rampant across the nation. Another thing that if we think about these police shows, if we were able to think about shows from a different perspective, we might be more able to see bias as part of a system rather than a problem of individual bad actors. I think I have watched a lot of cop shows. There are bad cops on these shows, but they tend to be one bad guy who is then removed from the show or is demonstrably bad, and whereas the rest of the system is good. I think we could imagine more television shows where the bias was part of the system rather than one unfortunate bad apple. The other thing that, and I was sort of getting at this idea of the same idea in the idea of innocence as typical, but you could imagine how different it would be if our primary perspective on a police story was not that they encounter murderers all the time, and instead you were following police as they deal with the kinds of things that we actually ask police to deal with constantly, which are mentally ill people, minor domestic violence, and it doesn't escalate into murder, and it can be very tense. They deal with a lot of traffic stops. We see very few traffic stops on television in police shows, except for on Live PD, where they always escalate into something dramatic because they put it on TV because they already knew it was going to escalate into something dramatic. Okay, so when this idea about cops being super prevalent on TV became particularly interesting to me, it's something I have been interested in for a long time, but obviously this spring, as there has been this huge wave of protests against police violence, and I was revisiting this subject. I wrote this piece called "Cops Are Always the Main Characters," and I got a pretty predictable pushback, which is, no, they're not. There are shows where cops are not the main characters. Obviously, there are lots of shows where criminals are the main characters. Yes, indeed, there are. There are a couple different ways of thinking about these in relationship to police shows. For one, there are many fewer of them. Many fewer in proportion shows about criminals where the main character and the protagonist and the person that we are rooting for is actively doing illegal behavior than there are shows about police. Even a show like The Wire, a show which is regularly pulled up as like, but they're not always like that, because The Wire follows a great deal of really interesting, fascinating, thoughtful, rich characters who are drug dealers. That show, of course, also follows police, and so it has a sort of mixed, deliberately, fascinatingly mixed perspective on social systems. But yes, there are also shows like Breaking Bad or The Sopranos, where the main character is a really bad dude, and that's the point. I think it is really important as we think about criminal shows, to remember that because they are deliberately engaging in illegal action, and because the primary narrative thrust of the show is that they are criminals, they are still shows about being policed in a way that privileges cop and robber stories, this sort of push and pull between what is acceptable behavior and what is not. And in making this a show about criminals, it is as though we are constantly anticipating the arrival of police. We are following the criminals as we watch them evade the police, watch them almost get caught, watch them finally get caught, and we are essentially rooting for them to be policed in a way that fits pretty neatly with the same desire for the police to get the murderer that we follow in a more simplistic structure like Law and Order. Essentially, they are, for me at least, almost always falling into the same very simplistic police versus bad guys dichotomies that I think a more complex image of policing on television would ideally avoid. Okay, so I'm almost done and I'm very excited for questions. I do want to say that this part, I again, am a TV critic, and so this is just my guess. But I have this belief that I am not alone in this instinct that I have that telling lots of stories about cops, making cops the center of stories, making crime sort of the main narrative tension in so many of these shows. I believe that we feel like that benefits the police, right? There are cop shows everywhere. Probably that's good for cops. That's good for like our depiction of them as heroes. We feel like we want to believe them over the people who get cast as criminals. I believe that a lot of that is true. But I also feel like the dominance of this particular kind of police show on TV is not actually as good for cops as you might initially imagine. I think probably if everyone were able to imagine a system of, or were more familiar with stories of policing that were much more complicated, that were more thoughtful about the relationship of police to the people that they are trying to protect, that policing was seen more as protection and less as punishment. If there was a more realistic reckoning on television about the fact that, say, police are often called to deal with things that they are not at all trained to deal with, like mental health issues, that this would be a huge boon for police as well as for the communities that they are policing. And so this is just my guess, but I think moving beyond this kind of default police-centered storytelling would be good for everyone, and not just people who say, who feel like defunding the police was something that we should pursue. So to close, I am wondering if is there anyone in the audience who, like me, really, really likes crime shows? I have thought a lot about cop shows and crime shows. I still watch them. And I sometimes enjoy them, even though I do feel like there are too many of them, and probably they have led me to be, not thoughtful in the ways that I think about what society is doing toward policed communities. So you really like crime shows, but you're not sure what to do if you also need to defund yourself from crime shows. There are exceptions. There are shows out there that I think are much more interesting, complicated depictions of the relationship between police officers and the people that they are policing. Orange is the New Black is a show, of course, about women who are in a prison. And so already you are moving away from this police-centric view into something where the protagonists of that show are the subjects of police action. There's a fascinating show on Netflix called Unbelievable, which follows a very familiar police narrative. It's two detectives who are trying to find a rapist, but it very deliberately bounces back and forth between not policed and policing narrative, not just the detectives and the bad guy, but the detectives and the victim, whose story goes on far beyond her initial reaction, her initial interactions with the cops. And because they allow her part of the story to unspool in tandem with this police investigation, it dramatically changes the way that you understand what that experience of crime is like. It is not just this cat and mouse thing. It is a much more human experience of this traumatic event. There is also there are a lot of television shows, genres that I really like, where there are detectives who are not police officers. One of my favorites is the Number One Ladies Detective Agency on HBO, where the detective is a woman. I think it's fascinating when television and other narrative forms find detective figures who are from the outside, because I think those are, and in this case, because she is female and she lives in Zimbabwe, she is often able to have access to, she is not considered to be, a powerful, potentially threatening figure for a lot of the much more minor kinds of criminals who she's investigating. And so she has access and can see and can understand all these kinds of things that more traditional cops could not. And so finally, the question is it actually bad to like these shows? I mean, if you were to listen to all of this and come to the conclusion that these cop shows are doing bad things in the world, should you feel bad about watching them? Should you stop watching them? And my answer is no, because feeling shame about the things that we enjoy never works. It is never the right way to change anyone's behavior or to change your mind about anything. Shame, I think, is just a completely, in addition to being destructive, just not productive way forward. But if you, and I assume you will, as I will, continue to watch Law & Order SVU, the important thing for me is to consider all of the different ways that show is existing and telling these stories about these characters. So still watch it, still enjoy it, but try to be thoughtful about what parts of it you find comforting. I find crime shows comforting because I know that there will be a crime at the beginning and there will be a solution at the end. And I can take pleasure in that while also recognizing that it is not the way these cases exist in the real world, and that they are creating this narrative framework very deliberately, very artificially for my comfort and not to tell real stories about the police. Be thoughtful about the kinds of assumptions that these shows are making. Try to look at who we spend the most time with, how long people of color are on screen versus white people, how long police officers are on screen versus the people that they are interviewing, the victims of these crimes versus their family members versus members of their community. How much do we know about the police officers? Do we know their names? Do we know their lives? Do we know their families? How much do we know about the victims? How much do we know about their families? Usually not as much. Try to just probe the way that these shows are being built so that when you take pleasure in them, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, you are also understanding that they are shifting your perspective in one way versus another. And then be serious about the differences between what is happening on screen and what is happening in the world. I think this is something we instinctively understand about most television, that it is not real. But even as we are sort of knowing that, it is easy to overlook the way that we are still subtly being shaped by these shows, that we are still subtly trusting a police report more than, say, the report of somebody on the street, that we are still maybe instinctively thinking, well, you know, as in my example earlier, they really knew he was bad, but like they just had to plant a little evidence to make that case work. We have to really be thoughtful about how these shows are different from the world around us, and ideally then pushing for and watching and thinking about narratives that are also presenting alternate perspectives when we find them. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for having me. I will put my face back on. You can see I work in like a basement bunker, so you can enjoy that. And I look forward to your questions. Okay, is my face back? Yes.
Your face is definitely back.
Hooray.
I'll kick it off with a question that I've been thinking of as you were speaking, which is, part of what's so appealing about crime shows is that the viewer gets to have the security of, the correct balance, like the status quo being restored at the end of the story, right? So are there other types of stories that are on TV now that would be accessible to a large audience that can give that feeling of security without necessarily having anything to do with crime?
Yeah, I think so. There's a genre of show called the procedural, which is a lot of what you're thinking about, that sort of resolved within the hour storytelling. And there are a lot of different genres of procedural. There are medical procedurals. There are predominantly crime procedurals. There are legal procedurals. But there are, upsettingly few about like other kinds of professions, which has always been a little bit frustrating to me. Like, where are the shows about the daily travails of, well, journalists for one, but librarians for another. Fantastic show, I think that would be. But yes, I think that if you are looking for this kind of rhythmic comfort, one of the shows one of the genres that I really, it seems counterintuitive, but House Hunters is rhythmically exactly the same as like Law and Order. You have a couple, they have a problem, there are several different potential solutions to the problem, and by the end, that solution is presented to itself. It is actually working on the exact same kind of procedural logic as a show like Law and Order. And so it does require just expanding your mind about like what is possible, But yeah, a show like that might be a suggestion.
Thank you. We have a question from participant VMS. Do you see a distinction between military versus cop shows? Do you feel that they treat their protagonists the same way?
So yes, there is a distinction, but that distinction is growing smaller actually with time. There is a real trend in the last like five-ish years away from a kind of police storytelling that was more prominent in the like 70s and 80s, where there was like one police detective and you could sort of see him, and he was, often, almost always he was a little bit rough and tumble, and he was on his own and he was solving like small crimes. In the last several years, there has been this real push toward militarized cop shows, shows like SWAT, shows like FBI. FBI also has a spin-off. FBI also, you could imagine just being like, your classic two FBI agents going out on their own, but it is not. It is predominantly about this huge office of people, and they deal with like massive bombings and things. They tend to pull out huge tanks, and everyone always wears a lot of bulletproof material. It is an increasingly militarized genre, and so I think that distinction has gotten much thinner recently.
Interesting. We have a question here. Oh, it's more of a comment, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to read it out from KRB, who shares that the House Hunters suggestion makes me also think of one episode competition shows like Chopped, The Ultimate Hotel TV, which also have very predictable beats and timing, and which use sound cues to tell you when to look up from whatever you're multitasking on, just
Yes.
like that like chunk chunk sound on Law and Order.
Yes, yeah. I think food competition shows and competition shows in general often have that really great. I'm a big Top Chef fan. I love a great British Bake Off, and I think it's funny because they seem so superficially different. But if what you are looking is for is that like that rhythmic sense of episodic comfort, then yeah, those are 1,000% in the same wheelhouse.
Chris Miranda asks, do you mind expanding a little on your discussion of shows like Brooklyn Nine-Nine in your original article? I've been wondering if a Parks and Rec style show that went even a little bit further and was about, for example, reforming a police department, but still in that like bright and idealistic public service tone would be a step in the right direction, or would it still be likely to fall into the same trap as Brooklyn Nine-Nine? And you might want to, like, for people who don't watch that show, if you could give a little context, I think that would be
Sure.
helpful.
So Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a sitcom. It's a workplace comedy set in a police department in Brooklyn, the Nine-Nine. And it's full of familiar workplace comedy tropes. The protagonist is like a lovable goofball cop. He works with much more of a like hardline rule follower partner. There are like goofy old timers who never know what they're doing. There are people who are really on the job and who are, the captain is a very stern and lovable. He's played by Andre Brower. And it's a show that's gotten a lot of, it has been beloved for its duration. It's just a really sweet, funny, well-made, incredibly warm show, but it is also a show about cops, right? And so in the last year particularly, although this is a criticism that's been burbling around from voices for a couple of years, is that a police show like this, where you're in it for their personalities, you're not really in it for them solving crime. That's kind of like a side benefit. You're more just there to hang out with them, is sanitizing the work that they are doing in the community that is often really negative. Like, this is a show about police that does not want to touch police violence with a 10-foot pole. And increasingly, it has become really come under fire for this warm, cuddly depiction of police officers. And the question is, which I think is a really good one, is you could imagine a version of this show where it was happy and idealistic, but it was also about sort of police reform. And would that be an okay version of that show in this moment, or would that fall into the same troubling sanitization narrative? I don't know. I would love to see them try. I think even just seeing that show really take on reform would be a step in a promising direction, and just being very real about that. I would prefer they should have done it years ago. I think I am not optimistic enough to feel like these shows are going to disappear immediately. And so I think the thing that I am hoping for, is more honesty about conversations about reform in these genres.
All right. Our next question. Ooh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to scroll up because I missed a little bit. Okay. So you've been talking primarily about American TV shows.
Yeah.
Can you address some aspects of British shows, for example, Broadchurch, Prime Suspect, Luther? Are there noticeable differences to both? And this is a question for both you and for other people who might be viewers of those shows. Have you observed noticeable differences from those shows created outside the U.S. as opposed, like, compared with the ones that we see on like American network TV?
Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of ways that they are doing a lot of the same kind of stuff, right? You still have police almost always as the main characters, and you still have this sense of, in many, it foils war. You are watching, like, there's a crime and then they solve it, and there's a murder and then they solve it, and it sort of happens over and over and over again. I think a couple of differences that I would point out is there tend to be more British shows recently that are about sort of single actors. I mean, Broadchurch is like a two detective partnership. Prime suspect is mostly her. Luther is Luther. And so it doesn't have that same arc toward the militarized police that I have been noticing in American procedurals in the last several years. One of the other big differences is just bulk. American shows produce 24 episodes of one show, and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of these things. And British shows, bless them, are 30 episodes is a really long run for a British show of any kind. And so there's just less. There are tons of British crime shows, absolutely, but the bulk of them is just not the same hundreds of hours as it is in the United States. An important, a really interesting sort of counter show in the British case is Line of Duty. We don't really have a version of a show like that in the United States, although I think they've tried to make it. But Line of Duty is a show about where the heroes are police who bring down bad police. And the United States is not really interested in the people who are working inside to reform the police as protagonists, at least not yet.
All right. VMS asks, is part of the problem that cop shows are one-sided, or that cops are sort of always the good guys? Like, what would a non-problematic cop show look like?
Well,
that even exists.
Yeah. I think it can be both, right? They are often good guys in spite of them doing all these bad actions, right? Which is the point of that graph that I showed earlier, that they sort of endorse the fact that they are good means that their behavior is good, even if it is ostensibly bad. Cops are often bad guys on TV. There are shows like The Shield where that is the case. NYPD Blue often had cops behaving really badly and cops who were good. I think for me, the bigger problem is that they are almost always cop protagonists or sort of anti-heroes, and that there are very few shows about. So for instance, what if you had a show that was about the Innocence Project, and instead of having the same rhythm of police trying to catch criminals over and over and over again, what you had instead were more shows, lots of shows, not just one, but like dozens of shows about like defense attorneys who worked out of a little storefront, and people who had been pulled over by the police and just were trying to get out of that particular court case and just needed help because there were no witnesses, right? What if that was our repeating narrative? For me, this would be a really interesting twist on the cop show. But again, it can't just be one. It has to be a predominant proportion of what we're watching on TV in order for the prevailing winds to really change.
Diane Johnson had shared earlier in the chat that she's not a super fan of the criminal shows, and particularly felt like when they're in prime time, like on Saturday night, which for her has always felt like a family time, sort of like a tension between those things. She then posed a couple of questions. What is your perspective on criminal shows? Like, do you see them as a positive, or do they a form of bias to gain public support?
I don't think that most of these shows are made to be deliberately biased. I think most of these shows are made for the same reason that most television shows are made, which is that they make money. Advertisers know that people will watch them, and so they become very popular, and so it's a sort of self-perpetuating cycle. I do think that once those shows sort of get that popular, once we get into this place where we are now, where they are a proven market, even other kinds of voices coming into the room pitching different kinds of shows are going to have a hard time finding space, because it is because there is inertia in TV, just like there is inertia anywhere else. And so once that narrative feels comfortable and familiar and proven, it's very hard to, all TV is an opportunity cost. If you have this much money as a budget and you're looking at 3 shows and you know that 2 of them are cop shows and people will watch them and one of them is very different, it is the responsible thing from a financial perspective to spend money on the cop shows because they will probably work for you. And so that is the bias that I see sort of present in it is the like responsibility to shareholders kind of bias that I find most troubling in the problem of these kinds of shows.
All right, we have the next question is from Myra Diaz, who shares that another option for detective and mystery shows would be something like Father Brown, where the relationship is between, among, I guess, the priest community, the victim or survivor, and the perpetrator. And she feels that that kind of show provides more hope and love. And like, I think also sort of embedded in that idea is like a notion or at least a gesture towards reconciliation.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there shows that you can think of that are in that vein?
Well, so it's really hard to watch, but I cannot recommend that show that I was mentioning before, Unbelievable, highly enough. It is very much about this tension between like catching the perpetrator and like how much reconciliation and sort of trauma sort of therapy and how much she's able to move past that trauma, the relationship between those things, the relationship between like her and the detective. Those shows are very rare, and I wish there were more of them. Father Brown is a really good example. It's also a British example. I think there are more examples of detective shows where the detectives are not cops in England. There are some really charming examples of detective shows. There's a show called Rosemary and Thyme where it's a pair of lady gardeners, and they solve crimes. There's just more of those in the UK. That history of the sort of amateur detective is not as strong in American fiction in the last couple decades.
Yeah, the main example that leaps to mind for me that on the American side would be Murder, She Wrote.
Right. A fantastic and great example of exactly that genre, but again, now several decades old, and there really isn't anything like it right now.
Yeah. The next question comes from Eric, who asks, with the acclaim that shows like The Wire has gotten, is the kind of depth of character development of the policed community members, especially since character study and development creates empathy, something that the genre finds value in today and would do more of, or is The Wire sort of like lightning in a bottle?
You know, I think that everyone watched The Wire and thought like, wow, that's an amazing show. And tried to, and was like, that's what television should be. And then it's so hard to write a show like that. It required a really particular writer and writer's room at a particular moment in history to make that show happen. One of the real problems of The Wire is also its real strengths, which is that in order to create that kind of character study, in order to have that richness and idea of a like entire system of really thoughtfully drawn people rather than a small group, nothing that you understand as meaningful happens for like 7 hours on that show, right? The payoff does not come until the end. And that is just an incredible narrative experience when you can put in the time. And it is incredibly hard to make that happen in 43 network minutes. And so I think that, as much as anything else, has led to the fact that show, you cannot replicate it. There's just very little interest and not just capacity to write it, because very few people are as good at writing shows as David Simon is, but also the audience will to just hang in there for that long before the payoff is small.
The next question comes from Bridget, who says, these discussions are a good reminder to me that those in power often drive the narrative. Our culture reflects that power. I like the idea of a show that takes the perspective of a policed community and puts that in the center. We're seeing this perspective more in movies, such as The Hate You Give and Fruitvale Station, but we don't really see this in TV shows. Do you have some thoughts about why that is?
There are a few examples, not many. I should also, but I should point out that there is a show, Central Park 5, Ava DuVernay's really important work from last year. Great show. Look, it is hard, this is a crude way to say this, but like they're real downers, those stories. And Fruitvale Station, these are vital TV shows. Central Park 5 was a great show, and it was hard for people to watch. And a thing that TV is really struggling with right now, not just in crime shows, but like across a lot of different genres, is that there is very little energy for things that do not feel good to watch right now. And there has not been a lot of energy put into how to tell stories of policed communities that are happy ones, because there are not a lot of happy versions of those stories. And so I think, that it's not impossible, but that is a math that studios and writers have not really worked out yet. Oh, sorry, When They See Us. That's the name of that show.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So KRB shares, it seems to me that both amateur and professional crime solver procedurals contribute to our misperception of the violent crime rate in the US, which has actually been declining for decades, and the likelihood that a given police officer will actually save your life.
Yeah.
So there's a real, the tension between actual reality and what we begin to accept as reality, because we are consuming so many of these stories that are told in such a particular way.
Yeah.
That really, that changes things.
It really does.
VMS says this is not so much a question, more thinking out loud, but I think it is really germane. It seems like you can map where a show asks you to empathize. Police versus victim versus criminal. Unbelievable hits the first two, police and victim. Orange is the New Black hits all three, which really makes it very complex and rich. And then The Wire is more about police and criminal. And I'm so glad, VMS, that you brought up the show I'm about to talk about, which is I May Destroy You, which is almost entirely about the victim / survivor.
Yes.
And the police, the experience that the female protagonist has with the police is like, they're very caring. They are really trying. But as of the episode that aired on Monday night, they had to close this case of sexual assault against the protagonist.
Yeah.
Lack of evidence. And so she's left sort of at sea, and VMS concludes this comment by saying it's hard to get that coziness dopamine hit, I guess, of a procedural, while also trying to manage that emotional complexity.
1,000%. 1,000%. I think, the only show that I can think of that does the procedural coziness and also emotional complexity, or at least is able to work outside of that kind of, tight police criminal dichotomy, is Number One Ladies Detective Agency. And it is because the detective is solving crimes that are tiny, that are minor. They are crimes of theft. They are crimes of stolen identities. They are, crimes of adultery. And almost always, as she's trying to sort of figure out what's happening in those cases, she is led into empathize for unexpected places. She finds her empathy drawn. But I always look at that show and I'm like, it is possible, but it is so hard to replicate, I think. And I May Destroy You. Wow. Fantastic show. I think, once again, fascinating to note that it comes from a British creator. And so it feels like, is working outside of a lot of American restraints there. Yeah.
Yeah, every time I see the police officers on I May Destroy You, which for those who are interested at home is airing on HBO right now, and I think 9 of the 10 episodes have aired. So if you start watching it now, you'll be ready for next Monday's finale.
It's a half-hour show also.
Yeah, it's a half-hour show. And it is like what the protagonist experiences with regard to her sexual assault and pursuing, remedies is bleak. But it's also a very funny show.
Yeah. Yes.
And the relationships between her and her best friends are so rich that it's really, really worth seeking out. And it's worth noting, didn't the number one ladies detective agency, how many seasons of that are there?
It is just one.
Yeah.
It is a crime. That's what the real crime is.
Yeah. So but that just, I think, goes to your point about how, these shows that might give you that feeling, they're hard sells, apparently. That seems weird because there's so many books in that series, and Jill Scott is such an enormously appealing actor. Come on, HBO. Yeah. So the next question that we have is from Bridget, who asks, how do the police themselves feel about these shows? And how do the communities who are policed feel about them? I'm in education, and the shows that feature the education system make her roll her eyes. Understandable.
Yeah. I have to obviously point out at this point that I am a fairly affluent white lady who lives in the suburbs. And so I do not have a lot of personal experience with, for instance, how frequently police communities feel about these shows. Very anecdotally, I know a lot of I know stories about a lot of police officers who became police officers because they are depicted as heroes in our culture, right? Like go into the profession in part because they are superheroes in TV and in movies. But I don't, that's something that I think I would love to know more about, and I don't want to speak for anyone. A show that somebody has been private messaging me about, which I do want to also mention, is a lovely, like, procedural rhythm. It does have cops in it though, but it's a show called Stumptown. It is working in the noir genre. I have not really talked much about the noir, but one of the great things about noir is that it is almost always detectives who are not police or who are former police who are working outside of a policing system, in part because they know that system is corrupt. And so noir as a genre is almost always suspect of police narratives in a way that is really fascinating. Stumptown is a sort of modern noir. There's also a show called Terriers that I'm very fond of.
R.I.P. Terriers. Probably the show I would want to come back somehow, even though they're not shooting television shows right now.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that you mentioned noir. I have a Post-it on my desk here that just says noir in big capital letters. Actually, would you be willing to talk a little bit more about, like, other noir shows? Is there contemporary noir, like, outside of Terriers and Stumptown? If you want to talk a little bit about the roots of that genre.
Yeah. So there is not as much contemporary noir on TV as I would like there to be. It's a genre I'm really fond of. It has always been more the area of books and film than it has been television, but there are TV examples. The roots of noir go back to, the 1930s, and the idea generally is sort of what I was touching on before, that the detective figure is in pursuit of a truth that is probably being disguised by institutions. And those institutions are probably, governmental institutions, police institutions, and it is the work of the detective to sort of be the clear-eyed arrow of what is actually happening in the world, recognizing, sort of sorting through, piercing these institutional veils. And it is a history with a really rich, complex, relationship to race, for one. I would recommend the work of Walter Mosley, who's a really fascinating and great noir detective writer. Devil in a Blue Dress has a African-American detective who is investigating, there are questions of like identity. Noir often plays with identity that feels like it looks like one thing and then is actually another. There are questions of like stolen goods. It is all very interested in land, and who owns land tends to be a returning theme in noir stories. If you have HBO, if you watch a lot of HBO programming, it's been very fascinating to watch actually the most recent season of a revival of Perry Mason, which is an extremely un-noir detective show in its beginnings, and they have sort of reimagined as noir. And the way that they do that is by having him begin as a detective who is working sort of against the cops, and then become a defense attorney sort of over the course of that first season. And so that show, I have problems with it, but I think that has been an interesting thing to sort of watch happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I also wanted to give you an opportunity to, I was just going to tee up a little Babylon Berlin for you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there are more examples of these outside of the United States. Babylon Berlin is a show, it's a German show about the period, the Weimar period between the world wars in Germany, and their detective, he's got the hat, he's got the coat, he looks every bit the noir detective, but the institutions that he is sort of working in and underneath and through are the incredibly complex political system of Germany at that moment, and the sort of rise of fascism. And I mean, great show. It is for me one of the most satisfying shows of the last several years, but it is not going to hit that like cozy thing, in part because unless you speak German, you have to watch it with subtitles, which I love doing, and I think American audiences are going to have to get better at over the next several years as American TV production drops for a while and foreign TV production continues because of COVID. So subtitles are something we should all become very friendly with. But I think that show really fits the bill. I should also add that the Swedes are very good at crime TV. Yes.
Nice. Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Linking back, you had mentioned Devil in a Blue Dress.
Yeah.
I just wanted to shout out the fact that there's a whole series of books featuring Easy Rollins, and they did make one excellent movie.
Denzel Washington.
And Don Cheadle's first ever starring role. He's incredible in that. I was seeing that and thinking that man is a star. So I just wanted to revisit that. Those are books that I believe we have at our library, which I encourage everyone to read.
They're great.
A more contemporary series is by Attica Locke, who was a script supervisor on the TV show Empire for a number of seasons. There's 2 out in her series that are set in East Texas, featuring someone who is apparently an incredible rarity. He's a Black Texas Ranger who sort of winds up being called back to the region where he grew up and where he has these very deep familial roots, but feels a little uncomfortable there now because of who his uncles wanted him to be and who he is now.
Justified stuff, but it's
very much a lot of father-son stuff going on there. Also some interesting father-mother stuff because he was primarily raised by his paternal uncles and barely has a relationship with his mother. But there is, as you were saying about noir, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on about land.
Yes.
In those books, and they're really interesting. I hope that they will come to the screen at some point for us. I have another question here in the comments from Heather, who asks, how about shows that are crime related but geared towards kids? She's thinking of Paw Patrol and also ones that are designed for teens, such as Riverdale, where like, the head of the biker gang is now the sheriff. And, Nancy Drew, that kind of thing, like how does that fit in?
Yeah, I mean, I kids, it's tricky. Kids are not particularly. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. Kids watching TV cannot follow stories that have overly complicated, that ask kids to empathize with like a system that is corrupt, that ask kids to follow really messy narratives. The things that we are collectively wanting as adults in these crime shows are not things that kids have been trained in narrative enough to follow. And so for my own kids, you know, I am deeply sympathetic with the desire to have these really the same cozy comfort that we as adults want in procedurals. They want those things in the kinds of shows that they are watching. In my own house, though, my kids do not watch Paw Patrol. That has as much to do with my own annoyance with it as it does with my feeling that it represents a police narrative that I am uncomfortable with. I am also aware for my own kids that if I tell them a thing is not allowed, they will want it more. And so my feeling about most kinds of fiction is that, like, they don't watch Paw Patrol, but it's mostly because I just haven't let them know that the TV is capable of playing it. If for some reason they started asking for it, I would let them, because otherwise it then becomes verboten, and then it becomes desirable, and then it becomes reinforced as a thing that they love. I would prefer instead to let them watch it and then talk to them about it. I think that's really the best way to deal with any kinds of show where your kid has an interest and you want to sort of push back against some of the assumptions that might come with whatever that story is.
Right, we have another from Chris Miranda who says, this is not a perfect fit for this conversation, but maybe worth bringing up since its IMDb TV revival just had its first table read. The show in question is Leverage, formerly on TNT rather. And that's about a team of semi-reformed criminals who do heists and cons on behalf of clients who've been exploited by the system and or by individual rich people. Mm-hmm. Mostly it's just a fun caper show, but deep down it is sincerely interested in who gets away with what kind of crimes. It only rarely checked in with the victims after the first act, but it always had a cheesy like gloat scene where the rich villain realized that they had been scammed by our heroes. He's curious to see what the revival will be like with the original showrunners there only in a consulting role.
Yeah. Leverage, you know, one of the models that for crime as a narrative that we really haven't talked about very much and which TV very rarely takes advantage of is the like Robin Hood story. But that's basically what Leverage is doing. It's doing Robin Hood over and over and over again. And yeah, that was absolutely like the very satisfying thing about that show was that it was using a kind of corrective, crime as corrective for worse crime, crime that we tend to police as corrective for the crime that we tend to never police, like, you know, pharmaceutical executives who, you know, charge absurd amounts of money for drugs. And that's the kind of thing that they would constantly be pushing back against on Leverage. Really delightful show. I think if they run it right now, I think it might have a really interesting audience. I for one feel like the moment is good for a show like that. And it is a kind of narrative that is easy to proceduralize, unlike a lot of these other models where we're talking about the difficulty of empathizing with complex systems over short periods of time.
That actually, Chris, your description of Leverage reminded me very much of a TV show that my parents did not want me to watch when I was a kid, in which I absolutely contrived to watch at every opportunity because they had said no, which was The A-Team. About a group of Vietnam veterans who were like escaped after having been jailed for, as they put it in the credits, a crime they didn't commit.
Yeah.
And like they're just hanging out in Los Angeles, going around fixing other people's problems. I do not really want to revisit that show. I'm sure it would not stand up to my current standards vis-a-vis like gender and race relations, but like I do feel that the time is ripe for something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as in everything, we then need to be thoughtful about like about vigilantes and mercenaries being held up as you know, models for restorative justice. But in absence of other kinds of restorative justice, I think fictionally it's a really interesting avenue to explore.
Let's see. Oh, KRB shares, my mom also has a weird fluke where Nana's TV doesn't get Paw Patrol.
Isn't that funny? Just it's some TVs really have a weird block. There's no explaining it.
No. Yeah, who could explain such things? It's just going to have to be a mystery forever.
Yeah, that one, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. One of our participants is Margaret Willison, who shares that Kathryn runs a TV podcast with her, and she almost assigned us an episode of Paw Patrol to watch, but the risk that her daughters would know that her TV could actually play the show was, the risk was too high. So obviously they could not do that. I have one last question, and we'll take another round of questions from participants if they would like. And that is, how does true crime fit into this?
Yeah, true crime is a really, it is its own thing. And I didn't want to touch on it too much just because in the presentation, just because it is a fully unto itself kind of a genre. But you know, a lot of the things that I want out of fictional TV about crime is why true crime exists. There are a lot of true crime shows that are sort of there because victims, you know, we have not spent enough time with thinking about the victims, and so instead true crime spends a great deal of time sort of, who are they, what were they doing, and there are some really fascinating, good, ethical, I think, examples of true crime. There's a show called The Keepers on Netflix that's really, really good. If you are interested in true crime at all, you should also check out the true crime, the adaptation of Patton Oswalt's wife, Michelle McNamara, her book about the Golden State Killer, which is on HBO right now. As a whole, though, true crime falls into a thing that I think fictional crime shows often don't, which is that they get very exploitative of real life people as they are telling these stories about crime. And so the thing that you are enjoying in a fictional show where somebody got murdered and we are going to find out who did it becomes very much more troubling when it is a real person and their real family. And so that is something that true crime really has yet to come to terms with. There are a lot of people who make true crime and tell true crime stories who are super aware of that and try to be very thoughtful about it and and are often telling these stories because they would not have been told otherwise. But there is a way that genre can often feel icky to me that is very different than the ickiness of like a crime procedural where it's like police heroism that I'm mostly responding to.
I think also in true crime, so frequently the victim, or, you know, more hopefully the survivor of the crime is a white woman. And I think that like who we choose to put in the center of those stories really matters too. So yes, that is something I have also been thinking about a lot.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So, all right. I think that we have responded to all the questions that have come in so far. And we're coming up on 9 o'clock. So we've all been here together for about 90 minutes. Thank you, everybody who participated. Thank you for your thoughtful and incisive questions and comments. Thank you, Kathryn, for your time and expertise. And thank you to the library for sharing this platform for everyone. We're going to, as we mentioned at the top, we're recording this, so it's going to be out on our YouTube channel as quickly as we can get that together and uploaded. Yeah, thank you all for being here this evening. We're gonna send out like a follow-up survey to find out more about what you'd be interested in these community conversations looking like as we continue. And yeah, just want to thank you all. Have a lovely evening. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really a delight.